Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday morning. My name is Monica Palmera. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior analyst with the California Public Utilities Commission, and really excited to be here today for our conversation. I'm also joined by my co-facilitators, Faye Mock, Sustainability Manager from City of San Leandro. We also have Nick Tippin from Point Blue Conservation Science. So together we'll be leading you all through some tough questions, hopefully some ideas and some solutions, and really make the most of the 2 hours that we have together today. Unfortunately, we won't have time for everybody to introduce themselves, but we do invite y'all to go into the chat and put in your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from today. So we can kind of get to know who's in the room and who we have. So diving into what we're here to talk about today. So today's conversation for our workshop, we're really going to be focused on talking about white supremacy in the workplace and how it affects our work as adaptation practitioners. So obviously a very, can be a big topic, one that's really important to talk about. We felt that it was important to talk about, and was certainly identified in the challenge questions, because it really, it's important for us to really ground ourselves in the work that we do and in the reality that we live in. And we understand that white supremacy and systemic racism, whether it's overt and in your face, or more often than not covert and systemic, they really hinder our ability to move forward with equitable and inclusive adaptation. So we felt that as adaptation practitioners, us as facilitators, as well as all of y'all, it's really critical that we work proactively to recognize white supremacy in the workplace, take action and steps to dismantle it where we can, and intentionally reflect on the connections to more equitable climate adaptation initiatives. So it's a big conversation, but we're hoping to really do our best to dive into it today. We're going to reflect on opportunities that we have in our lives and in our work, such that we can be better actors in our workplaces and in our adaptation work. And for this conversation, we're so excited to have Ariel Guerrero. He's a co-founder and managing partner at ONG Racial Equity Collaborative. Faye will introduce him a little bit more later in the workshop, but he's here to help offer some guidance and some constructive steps to help approach this challenge. So with that, before we dive into the conversation, we wanted to start by reviewing some group norms. So Julia, if you don't mind sharing that with our group, great. All right, hold on just one second, make sure I have my notes. Perfect. All right, so we have both a code of conduct for the adaptation forum as well as a group norms. The code of conduct is what you see here first and foremost. We're not going to go through all of it. And you can actually see what I highlighted here. Essentially, the code of conduct asks us as participants to be courteous and respectful of each other. This is not just a typical panel that we're having here. We're not just having presentations. We're going to be having discussions that may be personal, and people may have different feelings and opinions. So we're asking folks to be courteous and respectful for these sessions. But yeah, if you just want to scroll down, perfect. More specifically, we want to walk y'all through the group norms. And if you'll forgive me, I am gonna read them out loud just so we can all have them carry them forward throughout the session. So these are agreements that we make amongst ourselves, how we will conduct ourselves in the session. The first is that we want to stay engaged. So we want to stay present. We want to participate in the discussion and try, we're all on a lot of virtual sessions, but we're going to really try our best to not disengage, particularly for these really important conversations. The second one is that we want to practice compassionate listening. So we want to listen deeply and approach the dialogue with an attitude of learning, towards learning. We're going to test our assumptions and inferences and listen to understand, not necessarily to respond. Next, we want to take space and make space. You may have heard it step up, step back to practice brevity. That's something I'm going to work on too. Practice brevity to make room for others to share their perspective. Be aware of the privileged identities you may hold to balance your participation and create an inclusive environment. The next one is to be courageous. We ask you to take risks as you speak based on your personal experiences and respectfully share your honest thoughts and opinions, particularly on today's topic. Be personally responsible for pushing yourself into a real dialogue. And then the last one is to expect and accept a lack of closure. This one's really important. Overcoming these challenges of adaptation takes a lot of time, and there's not a quick fix, and we will not solve climate adaptation today or even in this whole track. But we are hoping that the process of this dialogue can serve as a really important stepping stone to tangible, concrete solutions. So we ask y'all to accept those. This Google Doc with the norms will be shared after the workshop. So as we move forward through the rest of the sessions, if folks want to add or suggest new ones, feel free to do that in that Google Doc once it gets shared after the sessions. So we'll be able to adapt these as we move. But these are the ones that the core ones that we're starting with today. And then just by way of Zoom etiquette, we're all pretty versed, but just to remind ourselves, we would ask y'all to use the hand raising feature if you want to be unmuted. Use the chat function. And then we're going to be doing 2 sets of breakouts. And as you are able and willing, we'd love for you to turn on your camera so we can try to make the most of our dialogue. And then take breaks as you need it. We will have at least one break, I know, in the session, but if you need to take breaks, take care of yourselves. And I think that covers it for our norms. Any questions, or Faye, Julie, anybody, anything I may have missed? No? Okay, I think we're good. All right, so with that, we're gonna dive in. Before we go right into the session for today's topic, we're gonna take just a minute to do a quick exercise that has to do more with our track for this adaptation forum, for the Equitable Adaptation track. And essentially, what has happened, leading up to today's workshop, as many of you have participated in the planning of this event and weighing in on what should be a part of this forum, we have some previously identified challenge questions. So questions that we are setting up these sessions to take on. And these have been all based on stakeholder input, your input, and other stakeholders. Key challenges that we are aware of and want to incorporate into the track. But we also wanted to take some time to go through those with you, just to let you know kind of what some of these challenge questions are that we're going to be sort of teeing up, but also give you all a chance to add some more, either add new ones or things that you've been thinking about that you want us to consider in terms of planning for this track. And also vote on ones that you think like, oh, I really want to hear about this one, give you a chance to voice that. So to do that, I think we're going to throw up Easy Retro. And then I think once Easy Retro is up, I can walk through the challenge questions. Does that work, Julia? Or do you want me to read the questions first? Yeah, okay, Julia's got it. All right, great. So she's going to drop also the link in the chat for us to use Easy Retro. And then I think, Julia, you were going to talk us through how to use it, and then I can talk through the questions.
Excellent. Yes. So this is the Easy Retro tool. Some of you may have used it in the past. It's pretty straightforward. So there are a few things that we'll be asking y'all to do. As Monica noted, there are some challenges that we identified based on previous stakeholder input. We know that this doesn't capture everything. So we'll be asking folks to identify additional challenges. It should probably say additional, not new challenges. And in order to do that, you'll click that bar, that plus button, type it in, hit that blue check mark, and boom, there we go. There's the challenge, and you can add as many as you would like. Once we get into the process of voting, you'll click that thumbs up icon that will show up for all of the cards you'll see in this right column as well as in this left column. There is also a comment feature that we may use if we have time to hear some more specific challenges that you're encountering, but I'll leave it there for now. And I just chatted the link to the Easy Retro board through the Zoom chat, so everyone should be able to access this tool and platform.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. We're always learning new tools. So just to kind of get us sort of thinking in terms of what challenge questions, identify the challenges that have been identified thus far that we're sort of considering in terms of planning the track, I'll just read them out. So the first is balancing longer term climate impacts with immediate community needs, sort of that balancing act of going fast while going slow. adapting to climate change impacts while addressing systemic racism and historic and ongoing inequities, reconciling the need to move quickly. This is the one I meant. Reconciling the need to move quickly and urgently to respond to climate change with slower, intentional process of building authentic relationships, cultural competence, and community involvement. That's the one I was thinking of when I said go fast, go slow. Also building power in place and support existing community leaders in advancing climate resilience initiatives, and developing a co-leadership model and adaptation that is centered in equity, recognizing government authority and role in adaptation. So again, these are ones that have been identified. What we're asking y'all to do is to vote on, click that thumbs up if you really want to hear about one or any particular of these, or put in some new ones. You can also vote on those. We're going to give y'all a few minutes to just kind of tinker with this, and then we'll come back and see what we have. Does anybody have any questions?
I'll just flag really quick. I think we'll give folks a couple minutes first to add new challenges or additional challenges before you start voting. And as Monica noted, the voting piece will help us determine what we should prioritize at future workshops. So before anyone votes, let's spend a couple of minutes if folks want to add new challenges. I'm going to stop sharing my screen since everyone should have access to that board. Do chat us if you are having a difficult time accessing that board.
Thank you for clarifying that, Julia. My apologies for getting that mixed up. New challenges first, then the voting.
And why don't I throw on some background music while folks are thinking about some challenges. Give me a second here.
Julia, it's a little hard to hear you. I don't know if it's easier for them to hear me since I'm not playing music.
I just realized, I was just looking at the chat. Sorry, y'all. So super quick instructions again. We'll spend just a few minutes for folks to review all of the cards that have been added and vote on up to 5 that you would be interested in exploring further as part of these workshops. You should be able to see what you already voted on. So try to get to 5 if you can. We'll give folks a few minutes here. And let me share out the link again for folks who might have joined us since we got started. All right, I think I'm seeing a lot of votes. So I think everyone has gotten their votes in. So Monica, I'll pass it back over to you if you want to share some takeaways here.
Yeah, thanks everybody for going through the exercise. This is just really helpful for us for our planning purposes. And Julia mentioned it a little bit. Some of the ones maybe that didn't get as much votes, we might be able to incorporate into like a broader topic that got more votes, that kind of thing. So we'll be thinking about all of this in our planning. But just to highlight some of the ones that got a lot of votes, it looks like some of our pre-identified challenges are getting a lot of so adapting to climate change impacts while addressing systemic racism. Hopefully we'll address, some of that today. And then, of course, keep thinking about that throughout the whole track. Reconciling the need to move quickly with, intentional process. Sounds like that's important. I know that's really important in my work. So looks like maybe we'll be able to do something about that. On the new one, some of the new ones, how to encourage retrofitting older homes without burdening renters. So a little bit more of a concrete challenge, but certainly with equity components and considerations built in. Innovative hybrid community engagement strategies for a post-COVID world. Yes, how are we going to be going in person, virtual, making the most of both? And then I'll just highlight one more here, developing co-leadership model and adaptation that is centered in equity, recognizing government authority and role adaptation. That one got quite a few votes as well. So like I said, this is just extremely helpful for our planning. So as we chart out the next workshops, we will be taking all of this into account. Anything else to add, either Julia or my co-facilitators, Faye? I think Nick is also here. Any other thoughts before we move forward?
The last thing I'll just note is if folks are interested in doing so and have time, you can, these are some big topics. You can add comments by clicking that comment bubble. And again, just making sure you hit that checkbox to just post a comment. Is there something more specific that you want to dig into, a specific challenge that you're encountering, just to make sure we have a deeper understanding of what your interests are as we start to plan for the next 2 workshops. So we'll share this out as part of follow-up so folks don't feel rushed in doing that. And I think that's about it.
Awesome. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Faye to get us started on the day and introduce our speaker. Take it away.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today. This is a really important topic to be tackling, and one of the reasons why we decided to focus on white supremacy in the workplace is really just the commitment to focus on equity and really center that work. As adaptation practitioners, if we're not really addressing that and prioritizing racial equity within our workplace, everything else that we do is really just going to continue to exacerbate those existing inequities that we see in society today. So hopefully, like, one of the things that we can really illuminate through today's presentation is just how those threads continue kind of in that day-to-day and beyond what we see in the greater society, that there's a lot of really internalized kind of conceptions that we might see, the concept of urgency, the concept of having only one right way to do things, and how that may play out in the ways that we both develop policy and also implement it. So we'll get a chance to kind of dive into that in our breakout rooms. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. We're really excited to hear from them. The name is Ariel Enrique Guerrero, MPA, who was born and raised New Yorker, whose career has been marked by bold choices and service. Ariel is the co-founder and managing partner of ONG Racial Equity Collaborative, a consultant collaborative working with institutions on racial equity, knowledge building, leadership, and implementation. Prior to that, Ariel's work has been grounded in over 14 years of experience in government, nonprofit, political, philanthropic space with organizations such as the National League of Cities, Lutheran Services in America, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, National Housing Partnership Foundation, political campaigns in New York City Department of Education. Informed, organized, and empowered are some of the core values of Ariel's work. He is committed to supporting and encouraging communities to be the catalyst for sustaining change they hope to see. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Ariel to present. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Faye. Hey, everybody. Good morning. It's always weird to hear your bio read out loud, and then you're like, what is all this? Right? It just feels weird to me every time I hear it written out loud, but I appreciate you all inviting me to share space with you all and really dive into this practitioner space. My name is Ariel Guerrero. I identify as he, him, his. I did want to take a moment. It's something that we do as an organization that's always critical, where we want to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. Right, part of the first step toward healing is telling the truth, and this nation, this society really has harmed many people through settler colonialism and genocide, right, through stolen land and stolen people. And so for ONG and myself, we choose to acknowledge that truth, right, the harm, the trauma, and the genocide, the violence that has occurred. Today, I honor the lands that sustained me and the first people of those lands, of the Catawba and Waxhaw nations. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so we support the sovereignty, right, and land reclamation of the people from whom this land was stolen. So I wanted to just kind of say that really quickly. ONG, Racial Equity Collaborative, focuses purely on the systemic and structural institutional racism side of this work, right? We recognize that interpersonal racism is there and very well and alive as we see it today. But we believe if we want to turn this corner, we're trying to create different outcomes for the people, right, that we hope to serve and we see who are most negatively impacted by policy, procedure, and practice. That's addressing the policies, procedures, and practices, right, that occur, that ultimately do dictate and determine outcomes of people's lived experience. And I think it's super critical that that frame be carried through this conversation because white supremacy has the interpersonal side of it, right? But we're going to be focusing purely on the systemic and structural side of it, right? So just want to kind of frame that for you all to kind of dive into this space. So, right, the system of white supremacy, it is something where we're oftentimes talking about white supremacy from an individualistic perspective, right? And so talking about it from a systems perspective can be a lot to take in, and we're not conditioned or taught, right, to really think through or be able to draw awareness around it, to call it out explicitly, to identify it, right, and to draw it out, because that's part of how we interrupt and dismantle structural institutional racism, right, and white supremacy systems culture, is to call it out and is to interrupt it, right, disrupt it, so that we can start to think about how do we transform how it's showing up and how it's playing out so that we can ultimately create a different outcome. And so this is also to think about, right, that we live in a society where this has been indoctrinated, right? We're not implying that all white people are white supremacists, but we're talking about a logic of like the nature of systems, right? How past and present patterns of socialization kind of come together to really determine outcomes of social policy and practices. And so when we think about white supremacy, is the system by which like all of these iterations of racism coverage, right? We talk about and how it shows up. The system operates covertly and overtly. Now, I will say we're seeing it operate a lot more overtly, right, nowadays, right? The white supremacy, both individualistic, right, and as a system and as a culture have been emboldened in this time, right, to show what it believes it stands on as its ideology and, right, and all the other stuff. But it's, again, part of this work is being able to call out and interrupt. As we think about the systems piece, I often say this, and right, I feel like I'm a broken record when I say this, but our systems are not failing us, right? Our systems are working exactly the way they were intended and designed to, right? So when we oftentimes say the system is broken, right, we're actually addressing a false negative, right? Because it's not broken. We've got to acknowledge that the system actually is working exactly the way it was designed to work. Our education system, right? Our financing structure and system, right? We think about our housing system. Everything you can look at this, right, is embedded with white supremacy systems culture. And this is why we got to talk about this as a system, because it is interlaced in every single aspect of this, right? So again, part of just some of the frame as we continue to go through some of this conversation. And feel free, y'all, to use the chat. We got a short period of time here, but I would love to see what y'all are thinking as I go through this, questions that we can come parking lot some of this. So when you do go into breakouts, I can think about some of this. I have some responses for you all when we get back from the breakouts. And so there are some core components of white supremacy, right, before we talk about some of what this actually looks like within the workplace. And part of that is we think about this, these kind of four core buckets, right, as we think about white supremacy. And so this is control of material resources, right? This is power, privilege, and exclusion. And so when we think about this control of material resource, right, it's a form of power. But right, when we think about white supremacy systems culture, we also understand that power, right, rises, and we see it also live in like the organizational structures that we have. And why we've, right, talked about so much of this work from like a HR perspective is because we see, right, predominantly white males being in leadership positions, right, for so long. And so if that perspective and that housing is true, by which then power is held by those individuals, then like, how does that show up in outcomes down the road, right? So for us, there's a really critical historical through line that occurs that we've got to acknowledge. Our outcomes that we see today, right, are not a product solely of the last like year, 6 months, 5 years, 3 years, right? It's a product of generations, right? These things build up slowly. And when we do this work, one of the most challenging and difficult parts of this, right, is peeling back the onion. It's realizing that when you start to dive into one policy or one procedure or one practice, you start peeling it back, you realize how deep this thing really goes, how core it is to like the organizational, right, core critical functions. And so one of the things I'm gonna say that I didn't plan to say here, that it was interesting, is when we think about this work, right, this is organizational change work. Because, right, we can't just like take one policy. We're talking about transforming fundamentally how organizations do what they do, right? We've got to deconstruct to then reconstruct what we believe will provide and create space for equity, really, and collective liberation. And so these are some of the, again, the kind of 4 core buckets as we go through some of these other pieces of where it shows up, kind of wanting to keep in the back of your head. Okay, I'm just trying to keep track of the chat as well while I do this. So control of resources and power. I'm from New York, right? And I think if you think about New York as I'm going to say this political reference only because I think it's important about ideology, right? It's a blue state, right? Blue city. But then when you think about New York has one of the most segregated school systems in the country, right? Today. And what does that mean? We talk about the power by which is held in some of these community education councils, which are the school boards, right? We think about where power is held from a financial standpoint, right? And what does that mean for the education system? Like all systems, white supremacy is comprised of several, right, of these kind of several core buckets. And as we think about this, we've got to think about economic power and social power, right? And how white supremacy systems culture hoards resources. We see this in organizations all the time as well, right? This is not necessarily just from a public policy standpoint, but this happens within organizations. We see where power hoarding, right, happens and controls. One of the core pieces of doing racial equity work, and if we want to think about actually creating policy, procedure, and practice, it's going to have positive benefits and outcomes, particularly to those most negatively impacted communities, then we've got to talk about creating in a completely different paradigm, right, where we're sharing power, where we're giving those communities, those most negatively impacted, right, power control of the resources, of the solutions and ideations that come out, right, in terms of what's going to happen in those communities that will ultimately impact them. And again, this is part of disrupting that white supremacy systems culture that, like, you have the answer, right? I cannot tell you oftentimes, when I used to work in local government, folks, some of the most brilliant people in the room, right? PhDs, MPAs, all the other degrees you can add on, right? Alphabet soup. Problem is they never ever would step foot in the community that they're trying to work towards and work with, right? They don't understand the dynamic of the culture, what impacts outside of the ground, right? It's not just a policy thing. And so thinking about how we begin to shift these is super critical, right, to doing this work and be able to begin to shift these pieces. Privilege really is that concept, right, that we see all the time to show up. And this happens within organizations. We see this happen in broader society leadership, right? Barbecue Becky and others, right, where we see whiteness and white supremacy systems culture leverage itself, right, to weaponize. And it weaponizes itself. And we see this, again, not only when you're walking a dog or you're running through a neighborhood, but we see this in organizations, right, as you move and navigate your running programs, right, and someone's always telling you can't do the program the way you write this program, or, right, their colleagues or partners, right, that are always competing around, one, this power dynamic, right, but also where whiteness seems to always carry the right to be the right way to do things. And so I think that's part of the unpacking that happens, that we've got to do some of this work around. And I will tell you, as a person of color, it's hard because I have privilege, but I don't necessarily have white privilege. All right. And I think that's something that is very different. And for someone who might be Hispanic or Black and might be white presenting, right, there's a different paradigm that exists here. And this is some of the stuff that we've got to call out and, again, acknowledge and be really aware of and do that self-auditing. So I think part of one of the skills that I really wanted to kind of hone in on, at least high level, is there is a level of self-auditing and self-awareness that each of us has to have in terms of our role and connection to white supremacy systems culture, right? Because even as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, right, male, I have direct connections to white supremacy systems culture, right? And I think about, I have to unpack where that shows up in my previous roles, how I perpetuated it, how I've not disrupted it, interrupted it. And I think that's part of, again, where we have to just think about and leverage, right, all those different pieces of this. The exclusion piece is also very real. Sorry, I skipped the slide and I can't go back now. The exclusion piece is real because, again, we see this from a day-to-day experience of where people are blocked out of the intimate relationship of power, access, acknowledgement, the variations of disadvantage and deprivation, right? Social deprivation, economic disadvantage, democratic disqualification. These things are all interrelated and mutually reinforcing, right? But they're not distinct. They're dimensions of an kind of an overarching phenomenon, right, of social exclusion. And that is a huge part of white supremacy systems culture, right? It excludes people. It separates into buckets, right, to purposely and intentionally exclude others, right, from access, again, to resources, to power, all these different components. And again, this is just something that it gets built in and it shows itself up in, like, again, how we think about policy, procedure, and practice. This culture is really powerful, right? Because it's so present, and sometimes because our country has not, I think this is a particularly United States issue, right? Our country has not leaned into talking about race openly, right? It's always gone to the interpersonal. If you talk about it, you somehow are racist, right? And there's all this other stuff that gets laid into it. But not acknowledging that white supremacy systems culture is the foundation bedrock by which all of our systems and institutions are built upon, right? And so if we're not able to call that out, we're not able to identify it, it just keeps moving on its own. And so this is part of just the skills. Like, it's very difficult to name and to identify at times. And we have to think about how we build the skill set within ourselves to be able to identify and explicitly call it out and then act on it, right? Because it's just not enough to just call it out and move on it. So there's this amazing resource, which I'm going to share at the end of this. It's just from the Center of Community Organizations. It's a Canada-based organization. They have this amazing tool on the culture of white supremacy. This is really this tool is like the foundation by which we build our understanding off of. The only caveat I would say to this, right, is that it's intended to be the starting point of our learning, right? So we use it as the foundation and build off of that and continue to find ways where white supremacy systems is showing up in organizations, right? How it adapts, different examples of it. But this is really the kind of core place where we start. Some of these you started to already call out earlier on, right? This sense of urgency, perfectionism, defensiveness, quantity over quality that we start to see up in the organization. These are all different buckets by which white supremacy systems culture takes shape in organization, right? And I'm sure as you all go into breakouts, that's why I'm going to be hovering over your Jamboards, right, really closely, because I know that all of you have a ton of different examples of where all of these things will show up, right? And calling them out by what it is. And this is the thing, right? Sometimes we need the language to put towards these things. This is, we call this the normalizing efforts, right? We've got to normalize this conversation so that even if you are the one that has the language, who else in your organization has the language and the knowledge as well? Because you can't be the only one to call out, right? Because oftentimes, and this is right, a basic piece where it shows up, when we have this conversation of equality versus equity, right? Many people use those interchangeably, and they're very distinct concepts. And so as we think about things like this, where we see perfectionism, right, where we see sense of urgency, there's a language competency and a knowledge understanding that comes with these to be able to identify them, right? So perfectionism is really thinking through, like, right, time and energy, right, the money put into things that we're always, I oftentimes say, right, we're not seeking perfection, but we're seeking excellence, right? And that's a very different space, because perfection means that there's nothing wrong. And that's really dangerous in government. That's really dangerous as we think about work that touches on the lived experiences, outcomes of people, because oftentimes those things are siloed and completely do not think about, right, the other aspect of a person. If someone is housing insecure, right, that's not the only issue they're dealing with. But if we're only focusing on that aspect of the person, what else are we missing, right? But we have this thing that, like, this is and this connects to another one of the tenets of white supremacy, right? We've got to be able to lean into this and think about that our organizations are not going to be perfect in terms of what we do, and we cannot fairly expect that our people in an organization are also perfect, right? And that oftentimes shows up in how it gets, how organizations act on imperfection, right? Where we start to see disparities in HR action, right? Who's going through different, right, kind of HR procedures and action. That shows up, and that's because there's pressure put on individuals around perfectionism, and if you don't meet that mark, right, then somehow you're failing. And that's not accurate, right? And it's just, those are some of the, like, that's one of the ways that it shows up. The other cool part of the document that I'm going to share later is that this document gives you some really insightful thought-provoking questions to ask yourself as an organization as they think about each of these tenets of white supremacy systems culture. And it also gives you some antidotes, right? Some easy ways for you all to think about within your organizations how you could begin to pivot this, right? So if you're seeing something like this in right perfectionism show up, or this false sense of urgency, this is how you begin to pivot and transform your organization, right? You're able to interrupt, you're able to call it out, you're able to disrupt it and say, hey, no, this is actually the course of action that we need to start to look at. And again, what I love about this is it's a great starting point, right? Because it's a great piece for you to all start to build the conversation around what might be the strategy or intervention that allows you to pivot away, right, from this particular white supremacy systems culture. Sense of urgency is one of the big ones, right, that we see a lot today. We've seen everything from the responses of, right, from the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, right, Breonna Taylor, right, George Floyd. We've seen organizations step into reaction mode, right, and we're going to stand on something and do something. But this sense of urgency is false, right? Because now there's a sense of urgency, but for decades and generations, right, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been traumatized, violence committed, murdered, right? I mean, all these different things. And now we want to do something. And even these actions don't necessarily take the step, right? They're performative. They don't dive into the policy, procedure, or practice. And so when we have organizations say, oh, we gotta go, the question comes to beg is, why do we have to go so fast? Why are we moving so fast, right? And this is some of the interruption that gets to happen. Sometimes it's a simple question, why? Why are we moving so fast? Because oftentimes what we have found in our experience working with organizations is that this sense of urgency rushes through steps that are necessary to center those most impacted and actually create meaningful transformation in policy, procedure, and practice, create different outcomes. So the other pieces I want to highlight, okay. I'm sorry, my computer's delayed. So I want to highlight some other ones that are some of the other tenets. And this is a 44-page document that I'm pulling from. So you'll see like there's tons of content in every single one of these. We've seen the worship of the written word, only one right way, paternalism, either or thinking. Again, and please give me a raise of a hand, right? Or a reaction on your Zoom, but how many of you seen one of these show up, right? Again, I can call out a ton of different examples of where organizations, everything has to be in writing, right? Everything must be, if it's not in writing, if it's not this, and that, or it's not structured this way, then it doesn't, right, carry weight. It doesn't hold true to what the work actually means, right? There's only one right way of doing things. This is where, right, the people's ideas and thinking around different strategies and interventions are pushed aside because we're going to do it this way. And organizations can carry that as well, right? That this organization does it this way, and that's the only way we do it. We've been doing it forever. We challenge organizations all the time to ask that question again. It's like, well, why are we doing this, right? Is it statutory? Is it mandatory? Is it something that's, if not, if it's a self-imposed practice, procedure, or policy, guess what? You can change it, right? And so there's not only one right way to do things. There is only one right way to do things, though, to maintain power structure, right? This goes back to, again, the power hoarding piece. Paternalism. See a lot of women on this call, right? This is massive and huge in organizations, particularly because, again, we talk about this history through line. If white males have been the predominant leaders, right, of organizations for generations of time, think about where that shows up and how that shows up. Right? Think about policy, procedure, and practice has been codified for decades, if not generations, right? That is informing other people's outcomes, right? And experiences. Again, we've got to be able to call these out and identify them, because even when we see a change in leadership, oftentimes these policies, procedures, or practices still remain, right? And so the organization continues to perpetuate this. Yep, constitutional interpretation as well. That Michael said, a constitutional interpretation.
Arya, I just wanted to do a quick time check. We're hopefully going to shift into reflection soon. So yep. Yes, if you can wrap up.
Let me just wrap this piece up, right? So these are some of the other ones. Power hoarding, right? We talk about progress is bigger, right to comfort. That's why there's a ton of these, and I wanted to just cover them high level. This gives you a sense of how and where they show up. And again, I think what I love about this document, I'm going to put it in the chat box now for you all. I didn't want to do it because tradition says, right, once you get a link, you're going to click it and you're going to look through it and then you're not going to listen to me. So now you have it, you can go ahead and look at it. But this has an amazing resource again, where it gives you anecdotes. It tells you, it gives you some of the base knowledge to be able to identify how this is showing up in your organization. Again, I think the added piece that we put onto it is that we'd ask that you look at it with the lens of where does it show up in policy, where does it show up in practice, and where does it show up in procedure? Because those are the things that guide how an organization operates, right? How you're executing on programs, how you're paying people, how you're recruiting people, how you're promoting people, right? How you're identifying where grant money goes, et cetera, et cetera. And so as you see this, these tenets will show up in the policy, procedure, and practices. And you get an opportunity to interrupt and transform and think about how you want to create something different for those. So I'm excited to see what you all call out in your breakout groups, and then looking forward to the conversation when we get back from those.
All right. Our reflection in our breakout rooms. So I love everybody to just take a couple minutes now, grab your notebook or just journal. We're going to do a writing prompt, which I will put into the chat here. And the question is just for you to write for another 3 to 5 minutes. How does white supremacy show up in your workplace? And just kind of reflect on some of the things that Ariel brought up in the last presentation. You know, how urgency shows up, how the one right way shows up, how, you know, the prioritization of the written word, how those things may show up. So Julia is going to play some background music. Yeah, we're all going to journal. So I'll give that to Julia. All right. Well, thanks everybody for doing that reflection. So after this break, we are going to move into breakout rooms to share a little bit about what you reflected on and how you might be working to dismantle systemic racism in your organization. We want to acknowledge that these conversations can be really heavy, especially if this is the first time that, you know, you're trying to look at this and dive in really deep. So we want folks to, you know, think back to our race-based agreements, being aware of your particular power and position within your organization and among society, to really encourage curiosity and growth, whatever that means to you. Participate in trying to be compassionate towards yourself and towards each other. Trust in your own experience and understand who might need to be prioritized in those conversations. If you want to be in a BIPOC only room, please raise your hand using the raise hand function, and Julia will manually move us into the breakout rooms for white folks and for BIPOC only rooms. And then, yeah, so we'll have maybe 5 minutes to do this stretch break. Also, just notice if you have any tension in your body, take this time to stretch. Make sure that, you know, you're moving your shoulders, moving your neck, releasing that tension before you come back into the space and be ready to dive back into these conversations. So with that, I'll leave it to Julia to keep time, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. And yeah, as she noted, do get those hands raised if you'd like to be in a BIPOC only room, and we'll make sure we do that. When we reconvene for breaks, give maybe 3-ish minutes. Grab water, grab coffee, and I'll throw some music back up, and I'll announce when we're ready to reconvene. So enjoy your break and take care of yourselves. Share my screen for the Jamboard. So folks, many of you likely familiar with Jamboard. In just a moment, we'll be breaking folks out into breakout discussions, and everyone will be assigned a room. So step one will be to go to the room that you are assigned. There are 2 questions posed here: how white supremacy shows up in your workplace, and then how you're working to dismantle systemic racism in your organization. So we're hoping you can use this sticky note function, clicking this icon here, typing your comment. Feel free to change the color if you would like to, and just moving that in whichever column that comment is for. You can also add images by clicking this icon. These are some heavy topics, and it may be difficult to capture what you want to get across in words. So if imagery is a better fit for you, feel free to use that function as well. Any questions on how to use Jamboard? All right, let me go ahead and share the link out to the chat. And we will go ahead and open up the rooms for the breakout discussions. These will be self-facilitated. There will be 4 to 5 people in total in each, or 3 to 5 people in total in each room. So yes, they are self-facilitated. Ariel will be popping in and out of various rooms to kind of check in on the discussion and also checking the Jamboards. I may do the same. So don't be worried if you see some of us popping in and out. We will go ahead and reconvene at about 11:10, maybe 11:12. I'll provide some time reminders, and then we'll get back together in the main session. So any questions, anything else before we move everyone into breakouts? All right, y'all, enjoy the conversation. We'll see you back here in just a bit.
All right, so we're going to give folks a minute or two to cut, just a quick minute to come back. Looks like most folks are back. The Zoom breakouts are great, but unfortunately it just cuts people off sometimes. So give folks a minute to kind of settle back in. So I know we had really good discussion in the breakout that I was in. Folks were really sharing, and it was really helpful to hear from folks. I was wondering if a couple of folks would want to raise their hand using the raise hand feature, and we can unmute you and would love to share some of your takeaways from your discussion, for your reflections from Ariel's presentation, any thoughts or reactions. Don't be shy.
I don't see my hand. Oh, where is the hand? Is it
I think, Julie, if it's okay with you, I think we can let you go ahead. Feel free to go ahead.
Okay.
And you just want to give your name just so we can know your name.
My name is Wahida Rashid, and I work for Caltrans, California Department of Transportation. And we had a wonderful breakout session. It was just time warp. I wish we could talk for another 20 minutes. But I just heard from, we had 5 members, and we were sharing a little bit about what the background we're coming from. And the sense I got from this is like the issues are very similar, no matter where you're working. And the systemic, racism, or it comes to white privilege, or all of these are working very almost like same thing everywhere. We don't have very it's a very systemic and uncomfortable conversations to have with your peers and staff and supervisors and whatnot. But I think these sessions will really help us to take away, go back, and at least have the courage and bravery of what we were talking about earlier, is to start those conversations and just not feel awkward about it.
Thanks so much for sharing. So anybody else? Maybe one or two other folks want to just chime in?
I'll jump in there. Victoria Vasquez, Sacramento Tree Foundation. One of the things I kind of recognized is language, right? Language translation, having all of our materials in English and rarely prioritizing our budgeting, putting those languages into multiple languages, I felt was a way of worshiping the written word in English.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's, I mean, it's very, considering how diverse our state is and how many languages we really should be, you know, thinking about and printing, and it's a huge gap. And we definitely have that where I work too. I'll offer one reflection. You know, Victoria was in the group I was in too, but I'll speak for myself and my own reflection and experience. Actually, two folks in our breakout actually talked about Public Utilities Commission and some of, you know, instances of where white supremacy is being perpetuated in the agency that I work in. And my role at the agency is to implement our environmental justice action plan, environmental and social justice action plan. So a lot of my work is to dismantle certain systems of, you know, how we've always done things, and thinking about how we can be more inclusive of other kinds of voices and communities, and really butting up against some of the structures that we're talking about. But I've also, you know, been trying to think a lot more about, and Adiel's presentation really highlighted for me, you know, how I even myself in the way that I do my work perpetuate some of those very systems, even if my role is to do otherwise. And so I think it was just it's just really important, at least for myself, to try to like keep those both in my heart and in my head, and proceed carefully and intentionally as I continue to do the role that I have, and just be more aware of how I might be playing against even my own purpose sometimes, and think about these structures more deliberately. So I'll offer that to the group. Maybe one more person want to share a little bit? Oh, we got somebody. Go ahead.
Sure. I'll hop in. Oh, go ahead. Let's see. Hello. Were you speaking with me?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Beatrice.
Okay.
I said your name correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you're
I
good.
would just like to say that my organization represents the faith base. We are the Inland Empire Concerned African American Churches. So we are the African American churches in the community. And because the churches have been the backbone of the community, so knowing that the white supremacists is very strong because they're in the majority, they've written the policies, and they'll come and say, okay, we coming to help, and they decide what the help is. So by our organization becoming the advocate, going to the community, the trust is already there for our organization. So we just try to use that trust to meet with the Board of Supervisors and those in power. And one way that we have been doing that is that we did this year is to come up with the supervisors voting on the resolution, racism is a public health issue. And so we're going to go, and they did vote on that, which was kudos to them that they did. And so through that, we are getting at the table. We are a part of the county goals. There were 10, so they added this one as the 11th. And so it puts us at the table so we can be heard. And so the majority, always rules, but with us coming to the table, being the advocate, it is changing some. Hopefully we can see it in the policies and not just in words.
Isn't that the truth? Glad to hear about all that good work happening in the Inland Valley. That's great. Thank you for sharing. And was it I'm sorry, Hendrickson, Kaisa?
Kaisa, what you got it.
Kaisa, okay, good.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was just adding the part that our program, which is a state-funded program, had to do a lot of kind of internal training and work to make sure that we all understood, even though we were all working on an equity program. A lot of us came in with different definitions, and so parts of our team were the ones who introduced us to the pillars of white supremacy and brought this to the forefront, where it really helped us right-size understanding our individual understandings of equity and white supremacy culture in that, and played a big role in how we try to implement things.
Yes, Excellent. Thank you so much. Ariel, if you are around, would love to hear some of your own thoughts, your reflections on our reflections. And any ideas and strategies for us.
So, I think you're all leaning, from all the comments, leaning into the right space, right? I love some of the highlights I heard, right? This piece around, Monica, you talk about the self-auditing, right? It's always, and even for us, right? We're a minority, we're 100% minority women-owned business, right? And we think about all of our policies, how we operate daily. We've got to unpack every day, right? When we think about even like how we work with other consultants, what does our contract reflect? Does it reflect our values? Does it reflect our practice, right? How does the language that shows up embed in that what we're hoping to achieve of collective liberation? That shows up in all of our organizations. I think it was Juanita, right? The first comment, if I'm saying your name properly, please correct me, right? So you said something that was so profound for me. I think it was perfect. It was the first comment that in your group, you all talked about experiencing the same exact thing, right? And this is why we say it's so important to identify white supremacy system culture as a system, because it is interlaced in all of them. And I think that's what's so powerful about that resource that I shared, is that each of you can go in, and even if you move around and jump around, you're gonna see the same exact thing show up somewhere else, right? And this is the daily and kind of consistent practice that has to happen, is that we're unpacking different aspects of the same thing all around, right? And again, if we start to normalize this conversation more, we can bring it to the spotlight that like your organization is not unique in dealing with this. Many organizations feel like they're out on a limb, right? They're the only ones dealing with racism and white supremacy. It's like, no, we all are, right? Because our country was built off of that. And so inherently everything that touches it, right, that is here is going to embed it, right, and be a part, like have some of that. And so I think each of you and your organizations are in different spaces, right? But again, I think there's that universal piece of what you're all dealing with, that, networks and space like this that allow you all to share what your experience is and how you're addressing it is super helpful, right? Because that's the continuous learning and kind of space improvement that we all get to do with one another. So for me, it's keep leaning into that, right? I don't like best practice. I'm going to say this out loud, and this might be super taboo. I hate the word best practice, right? Because what might be best for you is not best for someone else. Everyone is in a different place. I think there are practices that work, and there are practices that need adaptation to where your organization is and what you all do. Right? We do some work now with public utilities, and it's amazing to me how public utilities have such a role in this, right? But sometimes it's very distant for folks, right? I think about very distant potentially for engineers, right? Because they're very numbers and like concrete, and like it's hard to draw the through line between everything that's happened right in the past and how that shows up today, right? What that means. But I think it's this space that we all get to lean in and learn from one another. So I appreciate all of your comments, and like I was going through the Jamboards. Yeah, I got some really good examples and things that you all identified. So I would say keep up the good work, lean into the resources, and continue to learn.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Glad to hear we're proceeding on a good track. So we have about 5 minutes before we need to move forward. Want to give a little time for folks. I know folks are really excited to hear from Ariel. So just a little time for question and answer if folks have specific questions for Ariel, things that you're seeing in your workplace, or just open questions for him.
And Monica, is it okay if I share my email on the screen? This way, if folks want to reach us, they can.
Please do. Please do.
Let me know.
And folks, feel free to raise your hand, go in the chat, or it has been working for you to unmute yourself. So as long as we can manage that, feel free.
Cool. Bring on the questions, y'all.
Yeah.
And where's the chat box?
All right, go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Melis, I think.
Hi, it's Melis.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you all. Thank you for putting this together. I have a question about raising attention in an organization to some practices that uphold white supremacy, and how just tips on how it can be really awkward as a person of color, especially to have to do that. And any, I know this is a very vague and open-ended question, but tips on how to do that as a person in a space that is primarily white?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Right, oftentimes we already talk about the trauma and violence done to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? And how there's always a space where there's potential for that trauma and violence. And so like this only potentially creates more space for that. I think there is space where we often find times where the simple questions about why we're doing things the way we do them. But I would also say this is where the normalizing and the kind of internal organizing has to happen. We can't do it on our own, right? This is also what we say where like white people have a really powerful role, is that white people need to lift this up, right? It can't always fall on the backs, right, or the shoulders of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, particularly because that violence and trauma is towards them in their communities. And so, right, where is it that we can find, and I'm always careful with this word allyship, right, white allies, because there are also a lot of self-pronounced white allies out there, right? And so I would always say, if you've got to be able to find a community to be able to do that with in there. I will also say this, outside of like the ability to move around, right, and privilege to be able to move from job to job, the space that you create, right? Like there's always the conversation, like how much we as people of color, right, Black and Indigenous people of color, subject themselves to that culture as well, right? Where it's like, how can we bring that space and find some other space where we get to thrive? Because not all spaces are created for us, right? And so I think it's that balance where you've got to find your trusted folks to be able to bring this and elevate into the space. And I would also say one of the ways to do it that does not put let me not say that because that's violent language. One of the spaces to do that does not put someone potentially in jeopardy is ask simple questions like, why are we doing this, right? Why is this the way? And I think if you can get other folks to also ask that why, right, it helps to alleviate that space. But it's never an easy, comfortable way to do it. I think we just have to try to find ways to protect Black, Indigenous, and people of color from potentially the white violence that's laid into that. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but it's a really good one. I see Kristen's hand up.
Yes, Kristen, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi. So I had a question around how you maintain the efficacy of like a diversity intervention long-term. I find that, you can give a really compelling presentation or workshop and it really resonates with people, but then like, it won't be much longer before A, something doesn't get implemented, or B, it just gets implemented, not fully, and then it's like forgotten. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Investment. Your money is where you put your mouth, right? Oftentimes these programs and these initiatives are exactly that. They're temporary, right? And so they make them very performative because they put no money behind them. They put no infrastructure behind them, right? And this is why I talk about like the sense of urgency. So many organizations are in a rush to announce a D&I initiative or a DEI initiative and put nothing behind it. One of the things that we're major advocates for, and we talk to in every organization, right, that we work with, organizations that are committed to this work have to elevate diversity, equity, inclusion as a core critical organizational function, the same way they do the CFO position, the legal counsel, HR, right? Organizations make significant investments in the critical organizational functions, right, for the organization to succeed and thrive. We have to do the same with racial equity, with diversity and inclusion, right? Those things cannot live outside and think that, oh, we're going to just lay it on top of everything. No, this is about really unpacking and talking about how you're fundamentally doing the work. To your point, this is sustainable work. We've got to take decades and generations of how it's been done and unpack that. So I think for me, it's investment in infrastructure. If an organization is committed to this work, they'll make the investment into like an office, right, and staff positions, and they won't shortchange that investment, right? That's the other thing. You can't hire one person and expect them to take on an entire State Department, right, and that they're going to somehow change it by themselves. That sets people up for failure. And those sometimes, right, oftentimes are you're setting up a Black and Indigenous or person of color for failure because you're putting them at the head of it, but then having completely unrealistic expectations of what they're going to achieve and what resources you're giving. Again, resource hoarding, right? Resources you're giving them to be actually do this job. So I think resourcing and infrastructure are, I think, critical to what that means. They need to be critical organizational functions. Great question though, because oftentimes that happens way too often. It's performative.
What about lawyers? Listening to lawyers too much, because lawyers have gotten their clients into a position where they think they can win in bankruptcy. And that could be one of the most important ways that white supremacy is embedded in our system, is that lawyers think they can win in bankruptcy and still get their fees. And there aren't any reasonable limits.
Yeah, I think this work applies to whatever field, industry, space that you're in, right? Like we can unpack it in any space we're in. And I think this is where you get to, for each particular person, whatever your expertise or focus is, right? These principles and the framework applies. It's just a matter of applying it to that particular space, and how the policy, procedure, practice gets executed on.
Excellent. Real quick, we are at our time. So if I'm saying your name, Kaya, if you want to maybe put your question in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. And Ariel, if you wouldn't mind, answering her, that would be great. Because we need to move on to the next breakout where we actually connect this back to climate adaptation. So I'm going to hand it over to Faye to take us through that.
Great, thank you. I'm still having some internet connection issues, so I'm keeping my video off. But thanks everybody for diving into this question. And I just want to, we're already kind of starting to talk about how this is affecting our climate implementation. So I just wanted to reframe it again. Our next breakout is going to dive deeper into how white supremacy affects our work as climate adaptation practitioners. So, as folks have mentioned, there's a lot of ties to how this affects the community engagement process, if we're rushing too much, if we're thinking about the trust that's involved in really listening to folks and getting the right ideas and so on. And then also just thinking about, the real inequities with low-income people of color, still experiencing disproportionate impacts of pollution, access to resources, and then also all the really devastating different crises, how these different characteristics that we just talked about, how that may interplay with those inequities that we just mentioned, and how we can actually address them in the implementation. So with that, Julia is going to share the link for the Jamboard, and we're going to go back into our breakout rooms to look at this second question.
Excellent. Thanks, Faye. And also huge thanks to you, Ariel, for joining us. Huge round of applause you'd be hearing if we were gathered in person. So definitely feel free to reach out to him if you have additional questions, and we'll also share some resources after. New Jamboard link through the chat. So same deal, just make sure you're heading to the correct slide for your room. We'll have about 15 minutes for this round in the same room. So enjoy your conversations, and we'll see you back here in about 15. Welcome back.
All right. We have what, 15? We have 12 minutes, right? Quick. All right. So we still have some folks so we still have 33 participants. They've stuck around with us, which is great. Just wanted to invite, similar to last time, a couple of folks if you'd like to share some of what was shared in your groups, also how this shows up in your adaptation work. Feel free to raise your hand. Go ahead, Arcelia, maybe?
Yes, hi. So I didn't get to share this in my group, but it was something that I was just thinking about. One of the things that I've seen, right now I work for a private company, a utility, but in my past I've worked for several elected officials at the local level, and I've also worked as a doing community outreach for a small public affairs firm. So I've kind of seen it from different angles. And one thing that I've noticed is that, this discussion about like community engagement, we had several large infrastructure projects going on in the district of the elected official that I worked for. And as like the engineering companies were trying, or the contractors were trying to get the contracts for that particular project, they would come and meet with us, and I knew that their engagement was, pretty subpar. So our recommendations were like engage with the local CBOs, to have them be part of your team to do that community outreach, because we felt that they were more embedded in the community and had more, better relationships than this contractor or this engineering company might have. But what I saw is that as they were like going through the process of trying to win that contract, you would see them at these events that the CBOs were hosting. But as soon as they didn't win the contract, they had disappeared. And, so it was something that even the CBOs were noticing and felt like maybe they were being used as part of this process. So I don't know. It's just something that's on my mind. I think it is important to engage CBOs, but not to the extent where you're going to end up using them and then disappear from them. I don't know what the answer is, but I just wanted to share that.
No, closure is not required in today's conversation, but an important, especially as like, I feel like for agencies, we take steps to try to do better, but sometimes it comes with, maybe it's not always in the right, with the right intention or without the right follow through. So it's really important to keep in mind. Thank you for that.
Honesty.
Go ahead. Yeah. Who was that? I didn't see who that was. Oh, Michael, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think honesty is really important, and disingenuous honesty doesn't work, and it's there really isn't that much time with the climate adaptation, and there has to be a commitment to just agreeing not to waste time, to be reasonable. And this gets back to lawyers, is there is a limit. You gotta stop sort of posturing. And we have a real problem with lawyers in white supremacy, because Alan Dershowitz, practiced law, and during the impeachment hearings, but he betrayed democracy. And that is happening all the time, and we don't have time for it.
Thank you, Michael. No, there's no time for inauthentic conversations that aren't with our feet on the ground. You're absolutely right, particularly in our climate crisis. Want to give maybe, if folks want to chime in, but before we close out here, want to offer if Faye or Nick want to offer some reflections from across today, and as we start planning for our next session, if y'all want to chime in with any thoughts and closing thoughts.
Yeah, it's probably a lot of you feel. I think we just scratched the surface, and it's always a thing, at least for me, that we talk and we say we should do something. We never clearly define, because it's such a big topic. And one of the books I always recommend is a book that came out a year or so ago called Caste, and the author talks about how pervasive racism, sexism is. And as a Native person, I always go back to a religious doctrine that in the early part of colonial times, the Catholic Church passed the doctrine of discovery, which said basically if you were Christian, if you were white, if you were male, you could do anything you pretty much wanted. And so people went out and conquered the world, didn't care who they stepped on, killed, or took things from. And until we start looking far back into our history and seeing where some of the feelings of today came from, it's going to be hard for us to correctly address them and solve them and get rid of them. Not solve, but just get rid of them. And I think I congratulate you all for participating and beginning these discussions, and just I hope you're in for the long haul, because it's not going to happen overnight, unfortunately.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Nick said, and you know, that this work is not going to be overnight, and it takes persistent, consistent bringing it up back in our consciousness, because white supremacy is so kind of internalized and embedded within all of our different institutions in society. If we're not really conscious and intentional about addressing it, it will just kind of resurface. So, you know, this is just one of many hopefully workshops that we'll be able to kind of hold on this topic. And yeah, looking forward to having continued conversations on all this.
Thanks, Faye. All right, well, maybe we'll let y'all out with a minute or two to spare. Just thank you all so much for bringing yourselves to this conversation, for sticking with us for the time. I know it's been really enriching for me, and I know there's definitely things I'm going to be carrying forward from today. So I can't thank y'all enough for that. So just by way of logistics and follow up, so we will circulate the main session recording. So not the breakouts, but all the other main sessions have been recorded, and we'll circulate those along with some notes, as well as Ariel's presentation, the Jamboards, the group norms, if folks want to like review those and offer any others. And hopefully, Julia, maybe we can send around some other resources that maybe ones that EL shared and others, if that works. So, and thank you, huge thanks. I don't think I introduced them properly, to the LGC team, Julia, John. They've been so helpful in getting us organized for today. So thank you so much. And also Kelsey. And then, so I think that's will be it. Our next workshop is Monday, August 16th from 10 to noon. Julia, am I missing anything, or are we good to close?
That about covers it. Yeah, thank you to our facilitators, Monica, Faye, and Nick, and again to all of you for joining this workshop. Got deep, but also really only scratched the surface. So much more to discuss in the future. We all know that you're all busy. So the fact that you showed up and you stayed and you participated, that says a lot. So thanks again. We will share out everything that Monica just covered as part of follow-up this week. And we hope to see y'all in a few more weeks. So thanks. Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Until August 16th.
Bye, y'all.